What happens when a Republican man wearing a MAGA hat walks into a food bank for help? Judged by his appearance, he faces assumptions and stares, but by the end, something extraordinary happens that leaves everyone questioning their own biases. You won't believe the powerful connection he makes. Join me as I head to the food bank to see how a MAGA hat-wearing Republican reacts when he gets a surprising twist he never saw coming. Comments below. Where are you watching from? And if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel, Life Inspirational and Motivational Tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. It was a chilly morning when the doors to the neighborhood food bank swung open, revealing a crowd of people waiting in line. Men, women, and children bundled in layers against the cold slowly shuffled inside, their faces etched with a mix of relief and hesitation. This was a place of necessity, a haven for those facing tough times, where the kindness of strangers helped bridge the gap between hunger and hope. Among the crowd was a man who stood out, not because of his demeanor, but because of his bright red MAGA hat, the bold letters "Make America Great Again" stitched across the front. He adjusted the hat nervously as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Mark, a Republican in his early 40s, wasn't used to being here. The food bank wasn't a place he ever thought he'd find himself. Just months ago, he'd had a stable job, a home that felt secure, and a life that, while not extravagant, was comfortable. But life had a way of throwing curveballs. A sudden layoff had left Mark without a paycheck, and despite his best efforts, he'd been unable to find new work. The savings he'd carefully built over the years dwindled faster than he could have imagined. The decision to come to the food bank hadn't been easy. It wasn't pride that made it hard. It was the fear of judgment, the worry that people would see him as weak, incapable. And now, walking into the brightly lit space, the glances he received seemed to confirm those fears. Volunteers bustled around, organizing shelves, preparing bags, and greeting patrons with warm smiles. The hum of activity was accompanied by the occasional clatter of canned goods being stacked or the soft murmur of conversations. Mark felt a knot in his stomach as he made his way to the sign-in desk. He noticed a few people glance at his hat, their expressions a mixture of surprise and, in some cases, quiet disapproval. He'd been wearing that hat for years, a symbol of his beliefs, but now it felt like a target on his head. Behind the desk was Sarah, a volunteer with a kind face and a welcoming demeanor. She greeted Mark with a smile that seemed genuine, though her eyes lingered on the hat for a moment before meeting his gaze. "Good morning," she said warmly. "First time here?" Mark nodded, his voice hesitant. "Yeah, I wasn't sure what to expect." "Well, we're glad you're here," Sarah replied, her tone reassuring. "Let me show you how it works." As Sarah explained the process, Mark felt a small wave of relief. Her kindness was disarming, and he found himself relaxing, even if only slightly. She guided him through the aisles, where shelves were lined with canned goods, pasta, rice, and other essentials. Other patrons moved quietly, filling their bags with care, their expressions a mix of gratitude and quiet determination. While selecting items, Mark noticed a young man nearby glance at him, his eyes darting toward the hat. The man's expression was guarded, almost skeptical, and Mark felt his chest tighten. He'd been here less than 15 minutes, and already he could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on him. Sarah must have sensed his discomfort, because she paused and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just not used to this, I guess." Sarah smiled gently. "A lot of people feel that way at first, but we're all here for the same reason: to help and be helped." Her words stuck with Mark as they continued through the aisles. As they reached the end of the section, Sarah introduced him to another volunteer, an older gentleman named Tom. Tom was jovial and quick to crack a joke, his lightheartedness breaking the tension Mark had been carrying. "So, Mark," Tom said, handing him a bag of fresh produce, "what brings you here today?" Mark hesitated, unsure how much to share. but something about Tom's genuine curiosity and Sarah's quiet support made him open up. "I lost my job a few months ago," he admitted. "It's been tough. I never thought I'd be in a place like this, but here I am." Tom nodded, his expression serious but understanding. "Happens to the best of us," he said. "Life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it." As Mark continued talking, he found himself sharing more than he intended. He spoke about the struggle to find work, the sleepless nights worrying about bills, and the weight of feeling like he'd failed his family. Tom and Sarah listened intently, their silence filled with empathy rather than judgment. At one point, Sarah asked, "What did you do before this?" Mark's face lit up briefly as he talked about his job and logistics, how he'd worked his way up from the ground floor, how proud he'd been to provide for his family. But as he spoke, his expression grew somber. "I thought I was doing everything right," he said, quietly. "But I guess sometimes that's not enough." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but comforting. "You're doing the best you can," she said, "and that's all anyone can ask for." As the morning wore on, Mark began to notice something. While some people still gave him cautious glances, others began to engage with him. A woman shared her own story of losing a job and finding support at the food bank. A man joked about how his favorite canned soup always seemed to run out first. Slowly but surely, Mark started to feel less like an outsider and more like part of a community. By the time he finished gathering his items, Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He turned to Sarah, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Sarah smiled. "You're always welcome here." As he headed for the door, Mark caught sight of a group of volunteers sorting donations. One of them was the young man who had glanced at his hat earlier. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Mark hesitated. Then, gathering his courage, he approached. "Hey," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Mark." The young man looked surprised but shook his hand. "Josh," he replied. "Nice to meet you." Mark hesitated, then said, "I saw you looking in my hat earlier. I get it. It probably says a lot about me before I even open my mouth. But I hope today showed you there's more to people than what they wear." Josh looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we're all just trying to make it through, huh?" Mark smiled. "Exactly." As Mark walked out into the cold air, his bag of groceries in hand, he felt different. Lighter. It wasn't just the kindness he'd received. It was the realization that, despite the divides that seemed so vast, there was common ground to be found if people were willing to look for it. For Sarah, Josh, and the other volunteers, the encounter with Mark was a reminder too. It wasn't about politics or labels. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, about listening to each other's stories and finding connection in the places we least expect. That night, as Mark sat at his kitchen table, he thought about the people he'd met and the lessons he'd learned. He took off his hat and placed it gently on the table, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe, just maybe, there was more that united them than divided them. And that was a start. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt judged or misunderstood? Or maybe you've seen someone break through stereotypes in an unexpected way. Share your thoughts and real-life stories in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about empathy, understanding, and bridging divides. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to see more powerful stories like this one.